Right now, over 2 billion people open this app in a given month. Advertisers pay to appear inside it before you have finished scrolling past a single photo. Conservative estimates put its share of its parent company's value at well over $100 billion. It has a name recognized in more countries than most national currencies get used in. You would assume it started as a photography company. It didn't. It started as an app called Bourbon, and it did almost nothing that this app does today. You could check in at a bar. You could make plans with friends. You could earn points for showing up places like a loyalty card with ambitions. You could post a photo, buried as one feature among 6 or 7 others, and almost nobody used it. Picture yourself in that position for a second. You have a working app. It has real funding behind it, not a hobby budget. It has users, technically. Almost none of them are doing anything with it. That is the part nobody puts in the highlight reel, the almost nothing phase. Every huge platform has one. Most founders never make it out the other side. Compare that almost nothing phase to where this thing ended up. Inside its parent company today, it is credited with generating tens of billions of dollars a year in advertising revenue on its own. Its parent company's total workforce runs into the tens of thousands. It ships shopping, direct messaging, and a short video feature called Reels, launched in August 2020, built specifically to compete with a rival platform for attention. None of that existed in the original product. None of it was the plan. Its parent company, Meta, now runs this app alongside Facebook, WhatsApp, and Messenger, 4 platforms under one roof, reaching well over 3 billion people combined every month. 2 people built the version that made all of that possible, working out of a shared office with a headcount you could fit around a single conference table. Here is the reframe that explains everything that follows. This app is not really a photography business. It is an advertising distribution engine that happens to have a camera bolted onto the front of it. The camera got you in the door. The engine is what made it worth a fortune. Hold on to that as the numbers pile up, because on paper this reads like a photo sharing story. It isn't. It's a distribution story, and the camera is the bait. The camera was never the point. It took 18 months to go from a cluttered app nobody used to a one-word acquisition offer that made front-page news around the world. 18 months. Most companies do not settle on a logo in that time. So, how does an app with one popular feature and 0 revenue end up worth $1 billion before it has sold a single advertisement? That is the actual question this video answers. Not, how did a camera app get big? Everyone already half knows that part. The real question is what it was actually worth, and to whom and why. It's 2009 and you're in San Francisco. You're Kevin Systrom, a Stanford graduate in your mid-20s with a few years at Google behind you, and you've just left a startup called Nextstop to build something of your own. You've been teaching yourself to code nights and weekends for years, on the side of a marketing job, because every technical co-founder you've pitched has quietly passed on you. The App Store itself is barely 2 years old at this point. It launched in July 2008 with about 500 apps, and by late 2009 had already passed 100,000. That's the market you are building into. Young enough that a single well-timed launch can still reach a meaningful share of it. Mature enough that investors already believe a phone app can be a real company. You raise roughly $500,000 in seed money, mostly from Baseline Ventures and Andreessen Horowitz, working out of a shared office in San Francisco's Soma district. $500,000 is real money. At even a modest burn rate for 2 or 3 people, though, it buys you well under 2 years before you need either revenue or another round behind you. Spend at $50,000 a month, and that clock runs out in under a year. The product you build with that money is Bourbon, named after bourbon minus a few letters for the trademark lawyers. It's a location check-in app in the mold of Foursquare, then one of the hottest categories in consumer tech, valued around $95 million in its own 2010 funding round. Bourbon does a lot at once. Plans making with friends, badges for showing up places, a points system, and, almost as an afterthought, photo posting. Mike Krieger, another Stanford graduate with a stint at the mobile startup Meebo behind him, joins you as a technical co-founder in early 2010. Together, you build out the full Bourbon feature set and get a working version in front of a small test group. The usage data comes back and it's not close. Photo sharing is the one feature people actually touch. Everything else, the points, the plans, the badges, sits there unused, costing you engineering time and adding friction that pushes new users away before they ever find the one thing that works. Here is the commercial logic, not the inspiration. A cluttered product with one working feature converts fewer people than a simple product built around that one feature alone. You are not choosing photography because you love photography. You are choosing it because it's the only number on the dashboard that isn't flat. And your runway is short enough that you don't get to wait for a second miracle. So you strip it. Over roughly a week in the summer of 2010, you and Krieger cut bourbon down to a camera, a filter, a square frame, and a feed. Nothing else survives the cut. The square crop is not an aesthetic accident either. It's a practical one. A square image displays consistently on every phone screen, at every size, in a scrolling feed, without cropping unpredictably. It also happens to echo the shape of a Kodak Instamatic print or a Polaroid. And that resemblance does real work, because it makes a phone photo taken in bad light on a 2-megapixel camera look like a deliberate artifact instead of a mistake. You build the first filter, later known as X Pro 2, yourself, largely to disguise how bad early smartphone camera sensors actually were. That's the physical object at the center of this founding story. Not a phone, not a server rack, but a small, square, imperfect photograph run through a filter that makes a bad picture look like an old one on purpose. The very first photo ever posted through the app, weeks before the public launch, was a shot of a dog next to a taco stand in Mexico. Taken by Systrom on July 16, 2010, purely as an internal test of the filter he'd just finished building. Nobody at the time thought that image would end up in the historical record of anything. At the moment of relaunch, the entire company is still 2 people. You and Krieger handle engineering, design, and customer support out of the same room with no separate teams for any of it. You relaunch on October 6, 2010 under a new name built from Instant and Telegram Instagram. You expect a slow trickle, the same modest curve Bourbon had drawn for months. You get over 25,000 downloads in the first 24 hours, and your servers, sized for the trickle you'd planned around, start falling over by that evening. Within 2 months, you cross 1 million registered users. Within a year, roughly 10 million. You went from a feature nobody used, buried inside a product you were about to abandon, to a 10 million user platform in 12 months. That's the gap this video opened on. Now you know what filled it. Fast forward to April 2012. You are Kevin Systrom again, except now you run a company with 13 employees and roughly 30 million users, and you have precisely $0 of revenue. Not low revenue. None. You have never run an advertisement. Days earlier, you closed a $50 million Series B led by Sequoia Capital that valued your 13-person company at around $500 million. Do the arithmetic on that jump for a second. You went from a $25 million valuation in February 2011 to $500 million in April 2012. That's 20 times in 14 months. Then, before the ink on that round is even dry, Mark Zuckerberg calls. He wants to buy the company outright. Not license a feature, not invest, buy it. The number on the table is $1 billion in cash and Facebook stock. Run that number against the size of the company receiving it. $1 billion split across 13 employees is roughly $77 million a head. For a product that had existed in its current form for 18 months. For a company that had never billed a single advertiser a single dollar. By most accounts, Zuckerberg worked the deal directly with Systrom over a weekend at his own house. That happened largely outside Facebook's normal deal process. The board was briefed close to after the fact rather than the offer being built up through committee first. There's a telling detail from just weeks earlier, too. Facebook had quietly shipped its own standalone photo app, built around a camera feature. In the same window, it was secretly negotiating to buy Instagram outright. That's not the behavior of a company that thinks a competitor is harmless. It's the behavior of a company that has decided it would rather own the threat than outbuild it. Facebook itself, at the time, had somewhere around 3,000 employees and was roughly 6 weeks from its own initial public offering. Spending close to 1% of your own pending IPO valuation on a 13-person app with no revenue is not a conservative move. It is a bet made under real-time pressure on a company that had not yet proven it could make a single dollar. The consensus view in the press was blunt. This was reckless. Commentators called it an overpay, a panic buy, a founder's ego trip timed embarrassingly close to a public listing that was supposed to prove Facebook's financial discipline to Wall Street. Nobody was arguing Instagram was worthless. They were arguing it wasn't worth this much, this vast, with this little to show for it on a balance sheet. Value any company as a multiple of its revenue, and a business with zero revenue has no multiple at all. There's no ratio to defend. Every dollar of that billion was a bet on what an audience and its attention would be worth eventually, not on anything the company had actually earned yet. None of that $1 billion was really buying a camera app. It was buying the audience the camera had already gathered for an engine that hadn't been switched on yet. That is not how acquisitions are supposed to work. It's how this one worked anyway. Here's the part that gets left out of the retelling. The deal was structured as roughly $300 million in cash plus about 23 million shares of Facebook stock, worth close to $700 million more at the price Facebook was privately valued at that spring. Add those together, and you land near the announced billion. The deal did not close at that number, though. It closed later in September 2012, after antitrust review and after Facebook's May IPO, once the stock portion had to be valued against Facebook's actual public post-IPO share price. That price fell hard after the IPO, from $38 down under $20 within months. Regulators reviewed the deal for nearly 5 months before clearing it that September, time in which this company kept operating as a fully separate business, not yet part of Facebook at all. By some accounts, Facebook's own board discussed the acquisition in detail only after the core terms were largely settled between Zuckerberg and Systrom directly, a sequence closer to ratifying a decision than making one. The final closing value of the Instagram deal is widely reported at around $715 million. $1 billion minus $715 million is roughly $285 million of value that evaporated between the handshake and the paperwork. That's a drop of close to 29%. Neither side renegotiated a single clause to cause it. The market did it to them for free on the way past. It still worked out. That's the part worth sitting with. Here's the fork you're actually standing at. If you're the founder in this position, and it's a real one, not a rhetorical one, you have a fast-growing product, a huge engaged audience, and no revenue engine. Do you sell to a platform that already has one, or do you stay independent and build your own? Make the case for selling first, because it's a stronger case than people give it credit for. A platform like Facebook already owns the ad-serving technology, the advertiser relationships, the sales force, and close to 1 billion existing users to cross-promote into your product overnight. Building all of that from scratch alone might take years. It might cost more than the acquisition price itself. It might simply fail outright. Selling converts an uncertain multi-year monetization project into cash and stock today, at a valuation few independent companies ever reach on their own steam. Now make the case for staying independent, because it's not a weak one either. Every dollar of future upside stays yours instead of a parent company's shareholders. You keep full control of the product roadmap instead of subordinating it to someone else's priorities, someone else's culture, someone else's quarterly targets. You can keep raising capital at climbing valuations, the way this company just went from $25 million to $500 million in 14 months, and use that capital to build your own monetization engine on your own terms, on your own timeline. This exact fork got tested again about a year later on a different app, and the founder chose the opposite answer. In late 2008, Snapchat's Evan Spiegel reportedly turned down a roughly $3 billion all-cash acquisition offer from Facebook, betting he could build his own advertising business independently instead. He got there eventually. Snapchat still trades as a public company today, but it also spent years posting steep annual losses while it built that engine from nothing, by some measures not reaching profitability until 2021, nearly a decade after that decision. That's the climb this app got to skip entirely. Neither answer is wrong. Founders have built enormous companies both ways and destroyed companies both ways too. But whichever you pick, you have just locked in something you can't easily undo afterward. Whose infrastructure your growth depends on for the next decade? Sell, and you inherit someone else's ad engine, someone else's roadmap pressure, and eventually someone else's decisions about what your product becomes. Stay independent, and you inherit the job of building an ad engine, a sales force, and advertiser trust from nothing. On a clock, while better-funded competitors try to out-monetize you before you figure it out. WhatsApp took the same route 2 years later, on the same side of the fork. Founders Jan Koum and Brian Acton sold to Facebook in 2000 for roughly $19 billion, then both left the company by 2018, citing friction over advertising pressure and how much control they had actually kept. The fork doesn't close once you pick a side. It just decides which regrets you get. Here's a question, and it's worth sitting with before you answer it. In the spring of 2012, which is worth more to Mark Zuckerberg, an app with 30 million devoted users and $0 of revenue, or a fully built, fully staffed advertising sales division, hired and trained from scratch, ready to sell space on a photo app nobody outside tech circles had heard of 2 years earlier? Read that again. Which of those two is actually worth $1 billion? The instinctive answer is the sales division, because that's the thing that visibly produces money. It's the wrong answer. The users are worth more because Facebook already owns a sales division. By 2012, it had spent roughly 5 years and hundreds of millions of dollars building a self-serve advertising platform. That platform alone generated close to $4 billion of Facebook's total revenue of around $5 billion that year, well over 80% of everything the company made. What Facebook did not have and could not simply build on a timeline was 30 million people who already trusted a product enough to hand it their daily photos for free. That's the structural advantage underneath this entire deal, and it's not a personality trait of anyone involved. It's a cross-subsidy. Facebook did not need Instagram to invent a business model. It needed Instagram to bring an audience so that Facebook's existing advertising machine, already spent for and already working, had a new surface to sell against. Instagram never had to build an ad engine. It only had to borrow one that already existed and already worked, and hand over the audience that made it worth pointing that way. This is the reframe from the opening, playing out in real numbers. A camera bolted onto an advertising engine, and this is the exact moment the engine gets switched on. Try the arithmetic another way. Facebook's roughly $4 billion of 2012 ad revenue, spread across its roughly 900 million monthly users, works out to a little under $5 of ad revenue per user that year. Apply that same rough per-user rate to Instagram's 30 million users at acquisition, and you get close to $140 million a year in ad revenue, just from folding Instagram's existing audience into Facebook's existing machine, before either company did anything clever at all. That number alone would have paid off the deal in well under a decade, and it turned out to be wildly conservative. The rollout proves the point, and it's slower than people remember. Instagram ran its first paid advertisements in November 2000, more than a year after the acquisition closed, starting with a small handful of hand-picked brand partners rather than an open marketplace. Through 2014, it widened to more advertisers. By around 2000, any advertiser already buying space on Facebook could extend that same campaign onto Instagram with a checkbox, using the exact same targeting data Facebook had already collected from its billion-plus users elsewhere. Instagram itself never had to build that targeting system. It borrowed one that already existed, already worked, and already had thousands of advertisers trained to use it. For a sense of what building it alone might have cost, look at Facebook's own standalone camera app released in May 2012, weeks after the acquisition closed. It never found meaningful traction on its own and was quietly discontinued within about a year. Even Facebook, with every resource available, couldn't spin up a camera-first audience from nothing. Buying one that already existed was the cheaper path, not the lazy one. Within roughly a decade, Instagram's advertising business was widely estimated by industry analysts to be generating tens of billions of dollars a year on its own, a figure that dwarfs the billion-dollar purchase price by more than an order of magnitude. Even the low end of published estimates puts that single acquisition at having paid for itself several dozen times over. By 2019, research firms were already pricing this app's advertising business at well over $20 billion a year in revenue on its own. A few years later, some estimates put that figure above $50 billion, which would make it, on an annual basis, more valuable than most entire Fortune 500 companies, built on top of a purchase price that looked reckless for about 18 months. Now picture the counterfactual. Had this app stayed independent past 2012, it would have faced the exact task it was spared. Hire a sales team from nothing, build ad-serving technology from nothing, and convince advertisers to trust a 2-year-old platform with no track record, all while burning down the cash from its last funding round. That is precisely the task that broke other similarly funded companies in the same 2 years. You'll meet two of them next. There are two near deaths in this story, and they happen at opposite ends of it. The first is small and almost funny in hindsight, but it wasn't funny that week. Before the pivot in early 2010, Bourbon's seed money was already burning down against a product nobody was using. $500,000, spent at a modest early startup rate of around $40,000 a month, buys you barely a year before it's gone. By the time you make the call to strip bourbon down to a camera, you are already deep into that year, with no second idea waiting in reserve if this one fails too. Then, on launch night, October 6, 2010, the newly pivoted app's servers, built for a modest trickle of signups, took over 25,000 downloads in a single day, running on rented cloud infrastructure sized for a fraction of that load. They buckled repeatedly through that first week. A slower launch might have killed momentum before it started. A faster one might have taken the whole product down on day one, in front of the only audience it would ever get a first impression from. You got lucky on the margin between those two failures, and margin is not a strategy. The second near-death is structural, and it happened to two other companies in almost the same window of time in almost the same category. In March 2011, a startup called Color Labs raised $41 million in seed funding, one of the largest seed rounds in Silicon Valley history up to that point, for a proximity-based photo-sharing app called Color. The app launched to poor reviews, struggled to hold users past their first session, and fell out of the App Store's top rankings within days of launch. By October 2012, the company's assets and remaining engineering team were quietly absorbed by Apple, without a disclosed sale price for what was widely reported as a small fraction of the money raised. The structural cause was simple. Color raised enormous capital before it had proven anyone actually wanted the product, then burned through that capital trying to manufacture demand that never arrived. The second is Path, founded the same year as this app, 2010, by a former Facebook executive, Dave Morin. A personal photo and journal social network with real design polish and real early buzz. In February 2012, Path was caught quietly uploading users' entire phone contact list to its own servers without clear consent. A privacy scandal serious enough to force a public apology and a mandatory data deletion, right as this app's own acquisition talks were unfolding a few miles away. Path went on to raise a further $30 million in a Series C round in January 2010 alone, on top of tens of millions raised earlier, and still never landed on a durable revenue mechanism of its own. It was sold to South Korea's Daum Kakao in 2010 at a fraction of the value once projected for it, and the app was shut down entirely in 2010. Add Color's $41 million to Path's cumulative raise of tens of millions more across its later rounds, and you get well over $90 million of investor capital, chasing the same rough idea in the same 2 years that produced close to nothing lasting for either company. Same era, same broad category, photos and personal sharing on a phone. Two different companies, two different capital strategies, two different collapses. Both structural, both dated, and neither one about the founders being untalented. The app in this story avoided both fates for one reason that had nothing to do with superior product instinct. It didn't have to solve the monetization problem itself, on its own clock, under its own pressure. It got acquired by the one company that had already solved it. There are two ways to tell this story, and both of them are partly true. The version the company tells is about product focus, a cluttered app stripped down to the one feature people loved. Built by two disciplined founders who knew exactly when to cut. That version is accurate. The stripping down from bourbon to a camera and a feed genuinely happened, over roughly a week, and it genuinely worked. The version the numbers support is different. This was a company acquired before it ever needed a business model of its own, monetized afterward using someone else's advertising machine, whose founders spent 6 years running it inside another company's org chart before leaving. Kevin Systrom and Mike Krieger both departed in September 2000, publicly citing a desire to rediscover their own creativity. At the time, this was widely reported as friction over how much day-to-day autonomy they still actually had left inside a much larger company. Adam Mosseri, a longtime Facebook executive with no history at the original startup, was installed to run the platform within weeks of their exit. That's what the structure cost. Not money. Independence. The freedom to decide what this product becomes belonged, from September 2012 onward, gradually and then completely, to someone else's roadmap. In January 2019, the parent company publicly confirmed plans to technically merge the messaging infrastructure of this app with its other two platforms, a further step away from anything resembling a standalone company. Its own founders were gone by then. Decisions that once took place in a 13-person room were being made somewhere else entirely. Every founder who has since built a fast-growing product with no revenue plan yet carries some version of this story in their head, either as a template or as a warning, depending on which reading they believe. The honest answer is that both readings are true of the same 18 months. Focus built the product. A buyer with a billion-dollar ad engine already running turned that product into one of the most valuable single acquisitions in the history of the internet. That's the real founding story, not the one about a camera. Could it be repeated today? Some of it, maybe. A great acquirer with existing infrastructure is still a shortcut nobody has replaced. But the specific hole this app fell into, a fast-growing product with a real audience and genuinely no monetization plan yet, sitting in front of a buyer who happened to already have one ready to go, is far harder to find twice. Every investor since has read this story and gone looking for one just like it. Most of them are still looking. A camera people already trust, sitting in front of a buyer with an advertising machine and no audience of its own to point it at, remains one of the rarest combinations in the industry, which is exactly why this particular deal still gets taught. This was never really a photography company. It was always an advertising distribution engine. The camera was just how it got you to hand over the picture in the first place.